President Donald Trump has agreed to meet North Korean leader Kim Jong after an invitation by the leader of the reclusive state. Now, this is according to a South Korean envoy who recently visited Pyongyang. They said the meeting may come in May this year. Now, reacting to the news, U.S. President Donald Trump tweeted, and I quote, "A possible progress being made in talks with North Korea. For the first time in many years, a serious effort is being made by all parties concerned." The earlier South Korean envoy Chung Yong, who returned from the North Korea after meeting leader Kim Jong said Pyongyang is willing to begin negotiations with the United States on abandoning nuclear weapons and suspend all nuclear and missile tests while engaged in talks. Chung led a South Korean delegation earlier this week on a historic trip to Pyongyang. Now, during that trip, the envoys became the first South Korean officials to meet with Kim since he took power in 2011. Now, Washington and Pyongyang have been at loggerheads for months over the North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Both Trump and Kim Jong have traded insults and have threatened war. And joining me for more is our WION correspondent Steve Mort. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. with more details. Steve, this is a very big development. What further details do you have on this meet between the two leaders, which is expected in May?
Yes, that's right. A very big development indeed. You know, what we're hearing from the White House this evening here in the United States is that there is no date or place as of yet. Nobody is willing to commit to a time or a place for these two leaders to meet. What we are hearing is the continuation of some tough words that we have heard over recent days and weeks. You know, the South Koreans said in their statement outside the White House a few hours ago that the North Korean words would now need to be matched by actions. And that is something that we've also heard from the White House this evening in a statement from the White House press secretary. President Trump greatly appreciates the nice words of the South Korean delegation and President Moon. Of course, in that statement, they complimented President Trump's leadership as responsible for leading up to the developments this evening. He will accept the invitation of Kim Jong at a place and time to be determined. We look forward to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. In the meantime, sanctions and maximum pressure must remain, and that is key. We've had a concession, of course, from the North Koreans, according to those diplomats that met with the North Korean leader Kim Jong to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. But as of yet, there has not been a concession on the U.S. side. Still, sanctions remain. The U.S. says it will continue and go ahead with those U.S.-South Korea military drills that are scheduled in a few weeks' time. And of course, up until that point, those military drills have been very provocative as far as the North Koreans are concerned and are usually a cue for Pyongyang to carry out missile tests. So it'll be interesting. There's a long way to go. It's many months until May. Lots of details have to be ironed out. But at the moment, certainly this is the biggest development we've seen in many years in U.S.-North Korean relations.
Absolutely, Steve. In fact, according to reports, Kim Jong has said that he will stop all nuclear missile tests. So if this is true, can U.S. sanctions against North Korea be expected to be cancelled in the near future?
Well, you know, that's always been one of the prerequisites, hasn't it, that the United States has put on North Korea. You know, if North Korea does stop its nuclear weapons program, then the U.S. has said in the past that that is the only way that sanctions could possibly be lifted. You know, this is all pretty much up in the air at the moment. We're hearing reporting from the White House from sources saying that President Trump didn't brief many of his top officials before this took place. This is something we've seen time and time again in major policy decisions, that the president himself is the one taking the lead and getting out in front of these announcements and leaving his senior advisors scrambling. So, of course, many of these details are yet to be ironed out. It's going to be interesting to see which way the White House goes on this. But certainly, given that this happened very fast, very quickly, these South Korean diplomats only began discussing their meetings with Kim Jong here in Washington today, and this announcement comes out, the White House could pretty much go any direction on sanctions at this time. I think it's just too early to tell. What I will say at this point is that, this letter that was sent apparently from Kim Jong-un was in fact not a letter. We're hearing from the White House that this was conveyed orally by the South Korean delegation to the White House, that the South Korean delegation that met with Kim Jong-un took that message, his willingness to talk, to the White House, and that is where they delivered the invitation to President Trump. So apparently there wasn't a physical letter involved, according to the White House. This was an oral invitation delivered by the South Korean delegation.
Right. Steve, also, do we have any details? And if you could analyze this for us, what could North Korea be asking in return for these talks with Donald Trump?
Well, I think it's fair to say that North Korea would very much like those sanctions to be lifted. The North Korean economy is in a pretty desperate state. We've seen fresh sanctions from China imposed in recent months, in recent weeks. Well, in fact, we've seen very, very new U.S. sanctions imposed on North Korea. Chinese trade, I should say, has been cut significantly to that country. So we're likely to see a lot of pressure from Pyongyang in terms of sanctions. You know, it's been a non-negotiable point. And just at the beginning of this week, we've been talking about how North Korea has been unwilling to negotiate on its nuclear program up until this point. So the fact that it's made this concession now, you can expect that Pyongyang will really be looking for some major concessions on the U.S. side. And one of those things is probably going to be sanctions. The other part of this is likely to be the U.S. military presence on the Korean peninsula. Now, much of that is going to be down, of course, to South Korea. The U.S. military presence there is part of that long-standing U.S.-South Korean relationship, the military bases on the peninsula, and certainly the North Koreans are going to want to look at that very closely. One of the other interesting points here, and this could sort of set the tone for where this goes forward, is where the meeting is going to be held. Certainly, what we're hearing from many analysts is that South Korea would be a logical place for that to take place, which would involve the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un visiting South Korea for the first time. A North Korean leader in the south of the Korean peninsula would certainly be very historic, very significant. If the North Koreans are going to make those kinds of concessions, you can certainly expect them to ask for quite a lot from both South Korea and the United States.
Right. Steve, in fact, no sitting U.S. president has ever sat down for talks with a North Korean leader. So such a meeting would be a new diplomatic high for the two nations, isn't it? So this will be setting a new precedent for relations between North Korea and U.S. in the future.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, this is uncharted territory, really, and many of the questions that are being asked here in Washington is the role that President Trump himself played in this. You know, really the statement from the South Koreans that we heard on the drive of the White House a little earlier on was gushing, I think I would say, about President Trump, praising his leadership. And, it's certainly fair to say that up until this point there has not been a situation like this. You know, there's a lot of foreign policy, traditional foreign policy people in the White House that sort of generally tend to follow the foreign policy orthodoxy. President Trump himself is the factor that's changed. Under Barack Obama, under Bill Clinton, under George Bush, we didn't have developments like this. Under President Trump, we have had. So, of course, there will be some debate about the role that the president himself played, especially given that just very recently, just a matter of months ago, President Trump was calling Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man. threatening fire and fury, and also saying that his own Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, should not waste his time opening back channels with North Korea. That was just a short time ago, relatively speaking. But of course, things move very fast in Washington these days. And this change of tone, although surprising at this point, is something we've seen time and time again from the Trump administration.
Right, Steve. Thank you for joining us with all those details. That was our correspondent, Steve Mott, live from Washington, D.C. He was giving us the latest details on a historic development here that Kim Jong, North Korea leader, and Donald Trump will be meeting in May this year, which is a sign of a major breakthrough after months of threats and violence.